Welcome to this brief screencast on chapter 3, sections 3 and 4, looping. Today we're going to talk about looping and how the different control structures that Java supplies. So Java has 3 looping control structures: the while loop, the do while loop, and the for loop. And those are the only 3 they have. That's all the kinds of loops you have. They're all basically equivalent, so let's start off looking at the while loop. The while loop is got the keyword while, open parentheses, a Boolean expression, close parentheses, and if you only want one statement in the body, you don't have it in curly braces. So that would be, that one statement would be executed as long as the Boolean expression is true. The more generic while loop, the one that I prefer to use all the time, I always use the curly braces, is while loop, while, open curly brace, Boolean expression, close parentheses, open curly brace, and then statement, so you can have more than one statement in the body of the loop, and then close curly brace. And again, as long as the Boolean expression is true, the statements will execute. And once that Boolean expression is false, the statements will, the loop will skip over the body and then go to the next statement after the close curly brace. So let's do an example of using a while loop. So I want to write a program that finds the average of a set of positive integers entered by the user. And since the user is the one deciding when to stop, we don't really know how many times we're going to loop, so this is a beautiful use of the while loop. So our first step is to understand the question. So what are we doing? We're going to have to read in numbers, decide when they're done, but add them together, and then calculate the average at the end. So what do? We write down the question in our comment, and then we put in our boilerplate and call in this class calculate average, and it has a main, and the comments say what this thing is doing. I'm not using any command line arguments for this one. So now let's go to the next step, which is adding in our steps into the main. So I'm going to expand on the main. So the first thing we do, we want to say sum is, we have to keep track of the sum, so we set sum to 0. We count how many entries there were, set that to 0. And then while there are more integers to process, that's our loop, we're going to read the integer, add it to the sum, and count it. Notice how the indentation on those steps indicate that it's inside the while loop, so that's the body of the while loop. And once we're done, when there are no more integers, we're going to divide the sum by the count, as long as count isn't 0. Because if you divide by 0, you can't divide things by 0, you get an error, exception. And then we print out the average. So let's do the next step, which is refining our steps until we can write. So we need to read in the integer before the while loop, because we can't, while there's more to process, we don't know. So since it's positive integers, if the user types in a 0, that means they're done. And so we add the read in the integer while the integer is not 0, add the integers on, counter it, and then again we got to update that integer, so that step at the bottom is making sure that integer changes, and that's how we're going to make sure that eventually the user will type 0 when they're tired of adding in more numbers, and that will end the loop. You got to always make sure that inside your while loop you're updating that thing that is checking the Boolean expression so that it will end, or you're going to end up with an infinite loop. And then we divide the sum by the count, print out the average. So now we can actually continue on. The next refinement is to declare the input, declare the sum, declare the count. We read the integer, we print out the question. We then use the text.io to get the input, and replace the while loop, open curly brace, add the integer to sum, count it, output, read it in, close off our while loop. So our loop will be done. We then divide, but we can't divide if the count is 0, because that'll give us an exception. So the average is the sum divided by count, and we cast it to a double because sum is an int. And if you do the division without making it a double, this will be integer division, and we won't actually get a double for our average. And then we print out the average. So that is our example of how we use our programming algorithm to create a while loop to average the scores or the inputs. So let's take the next looping construct. It's a do-while loop. It's very similar to the while loop, but you see there's a do statement, the keyword do, and then again we have a single statement, and then we have the while. So we're checking the Boolean expression after we've run the statement, or the one that I would prefer everybody to use. If we're going to do it this way, use the curly brace so we can have more than one statement. Again, the while statement is at the bottom, so the body of the loop will run at least once. In the true while loop, the body may not run at all if the expression is false. In the do while loop, this body will run at least once. Now, we can compare while and do while. So if we have the do while as our thing, we could write a while loop that has the exact same behavior by having the block do something occur before the while loop, and then the do something's the body. So the while loop with the do something and the do something in the body is identical to the do loop above. Now if we want to make a while loop, we just wrap the do loop in an if statement. So if the Boolean expression is false, we don't execute the body. So that is the exact same as a while loop. And the third looping construct, what if you don't want to break at the beginning? So the while loop, you make your check at the beginning, and in the do while, you check it at the end. What if you want to break out of the loop or leave the loop in the middle? Well, you can use the break command to get out of the loop. So here's an example. We have a while true, which looks like it's going to loop forever because true will never be false. And we print out enter a positive number. We get that number. If n is greater than 0, that's cool. That's what we want because we asked for a positive integer. We call break, which will then break out of the loop and we'll start executing the line after the end of the while loop. But if they didn't enter in a positive number, we give them a message saying your answer must be greater than 0, and we go back to the top of the loop. True is still true, and then we ask it again. So eventually they will enter in a positive number. Break will kick us out of the loop and we'll go on to the next. There's also a continue statement that allows you to skip the rest of the code in the loop and go back to the top of the loop. It's not used as often. It can cause some very confusing code that you jump over some stuff, get to the bottom of the loop, and then you go back to the top to check your conditional. It's not used very often, but you can skip stuff to go back to the top of the loop. And finally, the third looping construct is the for loop. It has the formula of the keyword for, an initialization statement followed by a semicolon, a Boolean expression that, as long as it's evaluated to be true, continues the loop, and an update statement that updates the something. It's an update statement. And then as long as the Boolean expression is true, the statement's run. And the preferred method version of this is you have the open curly braces and you have statements. The initialization is done once. The Boolean expression is evaluated each time to terminate the loop, and is evaluated as the loop begins. So if your initialization does something and the Boolean expression is false the first time, you don't execute any of the statements in the loop. That's very similar to the while loop. And the update occurs at the end of the loop. So once the statements get to the end of the loop, the update statements get executed. So this looks very much like a while loop, or can be written as a while loop, with the initialization done right before you hit the while, the Boolean expression, you run the body of the loop, and then the last thing you do is you do your update statements. So again, they're very much like all these looping constructs can be written with all the other looping constructs. So when do you want to use, which one do you want to use and when? So my guidelines are, if you know how many times the loop is going to run, for example, you're going to loop over all the items in an array, you know how many you're going to do, then you should probably use a for loop. Because when I receive the for loop, I think, oh, we're counting something, or we're looping over some known number of things. If you don't know how many times it's going to loop, sort of like the example of how many times is the user going to enter in a negative number while we want to wait for a positive number, then you should use a while loop. And if you know that you want to run the body at least once, use a do while loop. Thank you very much.